The cabin nestled deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of civilization. Inside, a woman with hair as black as midnight and skin as pale as the moon lived alone, content with her solitude. Her days were filled with simple tasks, tending to her garden, gathering herbs, and reading by the fireplace. One stormy night, as rain pounded against her windows and thunder shook the trees, a knock echoed through her small home. She paused, setting down her book. No one ever came to visit. Not here, not this deep in the forest. Another knock, more urgent this time. She approached the door cautiously, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. When she opened it, she found a man leaning heavily against the door frame. His long brown hair was matted with blood, and his clothes were soaked, not just from the rain, but from the dark red stains spreading across his chest and back. "Please," he whispered, his handsome face twisted in pain. "I need help." "I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice steady despite the shock of finding a bleeding stranger at her door. Before she could say more, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto her doorstep. She stared at him for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, with a sigh, she dragged him inside. For days, the man burned with fever. She cleaned his wounds, discovering strange silver shards embedded deep in his flesh. She removed them carefully, setting them aside in a small wooden box. As she tended to him, he thrashed and mumbled, lost in fever dreams. When he finally opened his eyes, a week had passed. He found himself in a clean bed, his wounds bandaged, and the pale woman watching him from a chair nearby. "You saved me," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I did what anyone would do," she replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. Over the next month he slowly regained his strength. She fed him hearty stews and herbal teas, changing his bandages and helping him walk when he was finally able to stand. They talked about simple things: the weather, the forest, the animals that sometimes came close to the cabin, but never about how he had ended up bleeding on her doorstep. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she finally asked about the silver shards. "I found these in your wounds," she said, opening the small wooden box to show him. They were buried deep. The man's face darkened, and he looked away. I I can't talk about that." She nodded, closing the box. "I understand. Some memories are too painful to share. You don't have to tell me anything." "Thank you," he said, relief evident in his voice, "for everything." As his strength returned, he began helping around the cabin, chopping wood, fixing the roof, hunting for their meals. She told him it wasn't necessary, that she enjoyed his company regardless, but he insisted. "It's the least I can do," he would say, smiling in a way that made her heart beat faster. But she noticed something strange. Every full moon, he would disappear for the night. He would make excuses, needing to check traps in the forest, wanting to sleep under the stars. She never questioned him, and he seemed grateful for her silence. Months passed this way, until one morning he announced he was leaving. "But why?" she asked, surprised by the sudden decision. "It's time for me to move on," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Is it because of the full moons?" she asked. "Are you meeting someone else? Another woman, perhaps?" He shook his head. "No, nothing like that." "Then tell me the real reason." But he wouldn't, offering only vague excuses. "Stay until tomorrow," she finally said. "Just one more night. Please." He agreed reluctantly. When he woke the next morning, he found himself unable to move. Thick leather straps bound his wrists and ankles to the bed. "What are you doing?" he demanded, struggling against his restraints. The pale woman stood nearby, her face sad. "I can't let you leave without knowing the truth. Why do you disappear every full moon? Why were there silver shards in your wounds? Why must you leave now?" "Please," he begged, pulling desperately at the straps. "You don't understand. You need to let me go before nightfall." But she wouldn't listen. As the day waned, his pleas grew more frantic, but she remained firm. When night fell, and the full moon rose, casting its silver light through the window, the change began. His body contorted, bones cracking and reshaping. Fur sprouted across his skin, his face elongated into a snout, and his gentle eyes turned wild and yellow. With a roar, the werewolf broke free of the straps that had held the man. He stood in the center of the room, massive and terrifying, saliva dripping from sharp fangs. The pale woman, who had fallen asleep in her chair, woke with a start, but instead of screaming or running, she laughed, a soft, knowing sound. So, this is your secret, she said, rising to her feet. The werewolf growled, taking a step toward her. She opened her palm, revealing the silver shards she had removed from his wounds. But they had changed, melted down and reshaped into sharp, gleaming spearheads. With a flick of her wrist, the silver spears floated up from her hand. The werewolf's eyes widened in recognition and fear. Don't worry, she said softly. I'm not going to kill you. The spears shot forward, striking the beast's wrists and ankles. He howled in pain, collapsing to the floor. As the silver touched his skin, the transformation reversed, leaving the man panting on the cabin floor. She knelt beside him, her pale face illuminated by moonlight streaming through the window. I had my suspicions, she said, touching his cheek gently. Silver that burns werewolves, disappearances during the full moon, your desperate need to leave before I discovered your secret. What what are you going to do with me? He asked, his voice weak. She smiled, her eyes reflecting the moonlight in a way that seemed almost unnatural. From a shelf nearby, she took a small vial filled with a strange, glowing liquid. I've been alone in these woods for a very long time, she said, uncorking the vial. And I've learned many things about the moon, about silver, about transformation. She tilted his head back, bringing the vial to his lips. Drink this, she whispered, and then we'll see what the moon reveals about both of us.